Okay, welcome to whatever week this is, the 8th or the 9th, or maybe the 8th. This is International Crisis Management, and it is November 10th, 2025. A couple of general comments before we start. Let's see. A small number, 6 or 7 participants will be joining tomorrow, Tuesday, for that extra session on um, a simulation. We'll be simulating, this is an experiment, an actual thing that actually did happen, the Suez Crisis of 1956. It was a very strange moment in history. Uh, the United States found itself voting in the United Nations with the Soviet Union against France and the United Kingdom. That was a very strange moment, and there was actually some risk of a wider war. They say that the Suez Crisis really was step one in what became the Six-Day War in 1967. Thank you to the 6 volunteers who are going to take role plays in that. Again, this is an experiment because this is something that actually happened. It's not fictional, and anybody else is very welcome to listen in. Um, I'm honored that even though we did 2 simulations, there were 6 or 7 people who wanted more. Um, Thursday, Michael Clark. Michael Clark is a military analyst at King's College London. I think there's no higher academic source on strategy and on military analysis than the elite professors at King's College. Um, Michael Clark, who to be confirmed, but I believe he'll be joining us on Thursday. Um, um, Sir Lawrence Friedman has agreed in principle to join us. He's, I think, the world expert on strategy. Maybe December 4th. We'll see about that. The schedule is sort of changing as we go along. And as I mentioned in my um, Google Classroom announcement, Angela Stent was to be today, and she will join us, but not today. Now, um, I want to introduce an idea here, and we'll talk more about it in, I think, next week. But this course, as we've done it this fall, it's different each time in terms of who is free to be a speaker and the pacing of the assignments and such. We haven't really dealt with public diplomacy and what we call STRATCOM, strategic communication, FEMI, foreign influence and malign interference, FEMI, what we used to call disinformation. Um, and these things clearly, and propaganda, these things clearly all go together. And instead of trying to rush them in in November, December, I'm thinking maybe we'll have an extra modular course in January, February, devoted just to those topics: propaganda, public diplomacy, disinformation. This is a extremely important topic for us now, especially with the behavior, the malign behavior of the Russian Federation. I'm thinking maybe we put that aside and take it in a 6 or 7 or 8 session course in January, February. I'd like to find out, not right now, but if you will all think about that, would you want to do that um, extending into January and February? And if so, would you want this to be a credit course where you could be a certificate candidate? Just think about that, because trying to push it into the time we have left, I think we need more time on that very important topic. Um, Now, okay, those are the announcements. Let me dive into, let's see, share. Here we go. Okay. Now, today, um, I want to, in Angela Stent's absence, I want to get to a topic we would have covered sooner or later anyway, but George F. Kennan. Now, this is this may seem remote history to some. Kennan, as we're about to see, I'll put up the first slide here, and then I want to explain why I think we should be spending some time studying the life of George Kennan. Okay, 1904, 2005. George Kennan lived to be 101 years old. Um, Two reasons why I think it would be useful to pay some attention to the career and thoughts and the development of George F. Kennan. One, his analysis of the Soviet Union um, immediately following World War II gives us some perspective on how we must think today of the behavior of the Russian Federation. There are some startling parallels. It's amazing that 80, 90 years old later, we have a country that is malign, which is doing dreadful things in the world, as the Soviet Union did, and that some of the ways of understanding why they are doing this were perfectly articulated in George Kennan's famous so-called long telegram, which he wrote just after the war in 1946. 5,000 words, probably the longest diplomatic cable in American history, and the basis of the way strategists were thinking in the West, particularly in the United States, towards the Soviet Union. What do we do about them? Do we go to war? Do we avoid war? These are these are very vital questions, and they are questions which are extremely relevant today. Um, and secondly, we mentioned earlier in the course the notion of grand strategy. Now, if you could talk to George Kennan now, draw him back from the dead, and say, is it grand strategy you were doing? I'm not sure he would say yes. He was doing grand strategy, I think, without actually knowing that that's what he was doing. So let's take a look at him. And if we have time, I'd like to make some comments about his alter ego, Paul Nitze, who these were two brilliant strategists who never agreed on anything and who remained loyal friends through many decades, and of very different personality types, very different conclusions and suggestions about what to do about the Soviet threat. And yet they remained true friends throughout. I think it's a fascinating relationship. And sometimes if we just separate ourselves a bit from current circumstances and look at history and try to think of history as it was, uh, even more than looking back at it and making sense of it um, in the context of where we are now. I think just purely surrendering to history can be helpful, can um, can give us greater insights. Okay, George Kennan, 100 years. Uh, George Kennan was a tortured soul. He was a very unhappy person. We'll get into that. And he was a very subtle thinker, far too subtle for the period that he lived in. Um, Americans, even Americans who paid close attention to what Kennan said, had very different what does he mean? Give us the easy formula. If you believe X, Y, and Z, we'll look at what he believed. What do we do about that? I think these questions are relevant today. So I probably overused this slide. I just like this slide, grand strategy. I don't know quite how to define grand strategy. Tactics in a crisis, this course is crisis management. In a crisis, the tool we use to survive today, we call that tactics. The tools we use to imagine what problems we would encounter um, within a 2 week or a 2 month period, we call that strategy, thinking ahead. As Lawrence in the Lawrence Friedman quote, you can make a plan, that's easy, but strategy is a plan plus the added feature of imagining what could go wrong with your plan. Grand strategy, I've never seen a good definition of it, but let's just say it's strategy only over a yet longer period of time, thinking way, way ahead. Now, Kennan, of course, is famous for having predicted the fall of the Soviet Union, the wall, 1989, the disappearance of the country as an entity in 1991. Um, um, but he would never he seems it seems that he sensed that this was going to happen inevitably. He would never have guessed that it took 70 years to get to that point. Now, 70 years, I think, qualifies as grand strategy. Now, uh, Kennan is famous for the notion of containment in his two texts, which are basically the same text. In 1946, as the deputy chief of mission in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, he was understood. He wasn't the ambassador, but he was respected. People understood that this guy had depth of reasoning, and so he was asked to write an analysis. What in the world motivates Joseph Stalin post World War II? And his response was this very famous diplomatic cable, which we call the long telegram, 5,000 words. That's a pretty long cable, um, and which he reprinted. This was a funny little thing, but in Foreign Affairs, the premier publication on foreign affairs in the United States, published by the Council on Foreign Relations. This is the elite thinkers and their reflections. This Foreign Affairs magazine comes out every 2 months. I receive it at home, and it's sort of the ultimate pronouncements of what seem to be the issues of the moment. Kennan, I'm not sure he was quite serious about this. He published basically an adaptation of his long telegram 1 year later, 1947, which he called the sources of Soviet conduct. We call this the X article because he signed an X thinking he would be anonymous, but there were many giveaways. Everybody understood immediately on reading this anonymous essay that it had to be George Kennan. Let's get into it. Um, how do we know what we know about George Kennan? John Lewis Gaddis, who recently retired of Yale University, created a course at Yale called Strategy. And this was in the United States. This was if strategy was your field, you went to Yale and you worked uh, um, under Gaddis. Let me get something off my screen here. John Lewis Gaddis. Now, uh, Gaddis, by the way, a native of the state of Texas and ended up being a very close friend of George W. Bush. But that's just kind of an anecdote. Um, Gaddis, Bush, both from Texas, had a positive relationship. In 1982, that's a long time ago, Gaddis approached Kennan and he said, "May I be your biographer?" Now, Gaddis was known at the time as a historian, a specialist on strategy, and Kennan, I don't know quite what went into this conversation, but Kennan said, "Yes, I'm giving you exclusive use of my papers, my journals. It's all yours. You can talk to my Norwegian wife, um, but the condition is you can publish only after I die." This is, I mean, and Gaddis, the big event in foreign affairs in Washington, D.C. in the year 2011 was when John Lewis Gaddis finally, Kennan had passed away, and finally Gaddis was now morally relieved. He could take all the work. He worked for 30 years to gather information about Kennan. And after Kennan died, a few more years, Gaddis came out in 2011 with his book, interestingly titled An American Life. And this is a pretty profound moment because Kennan did not like the United States. Kennan, as I mentioned, was sort of a tortured soul. He imagined a utopian America sometime before his birth. I'm not sure that his fantasy of America ever corresponded to reality, but Kennan did not like the vulgarity, the monetary commercialism of America. He found it vulgar. When working on Russia/Soviet Union, he hated the Soviet government, but he had a profound sympathy and love for the Russian people and Anton Chekhov in particular. He was a very divided soul. He worked very hard to find the weak points in the government of the Soviet Union, which he hated, while at the same time he was deeply enmeshed. He spent a lot of effort learning Russian language and Russian history and culture, and I believe you could say he had a greater affinity for Russian culture than he did for American culture, and yet, in Gaddis's estimation, he was purely American. All things given, nothing simple about Kennan, many paradoxes. But I think Gaddis was very intentional when he called the biography An American Life. Now, there was another George Kennan. The one we're talking about, we call him George F. Kennan to distinguish from his remote relative, George Kennan, who had traveled in Siberia and who was an expert on Russia before the Soviet Union. Here's George Kennan, the grandfather's cousin, some remote family resemblance. Kennan died in 2004, and his relative died in 2024. So the first 20 years of Kennan's life, he looked to this mythical character in his own family, wanting to meet him, wanting to get to know him, but he never did. The George Kennan, the older relative, never agreed to meet Kennan. And Kennan's life is really a story of disappointments and anguish. His mother died 2 or 3 months after Kennan's birth. He blamed himself. He had deep psychological guilt. He thought he was desperately in need of a mother, and he did not have one. His mother died when he was, I think, 4 months old. So Kennan came up. We need to keep in mind what a tortured soul Kennan was, while also keeping in mind, I'm going to mute it. While also keeping in mind he was tortured, but he was also brilliant. And this very dangerous period of the Cold War, there could have been a nuclear exchange. I don't know if we could, it may be hyperbolic to say, thank you, Kennan, for saving the human race. To an extent, he did. His thoughts, when executed, he didn't have the authority to implement his own thoughts, but those who did went very, very much by Kennan's analysis. So again, nothing simple. Now, yeah, the grandfather's cousin. Here's the older George Kennan, 1865. He went to study the Russian-American telegraph expedition, and he looked through Siberia. I believe he crossed the entire country, and he looked at the exile system, the gulags in Tsarist Russia, 1885-86. And he said, the exile system is worse than I believed and worse than I described. So this ran in the Kennan family, the understanding that Russia is a vast country with an intriguing culture, and yet has some dreadful, dreadful components. Again, I think this is relevant to help us understand this horrible thing today, which we call the Russian Federation. Now, Kennan's childhood. Kennan had a lifelong relationship with Antonin Chekhov, obviously never met him. Chekhov died in 1904, which was, by coincidence, the same year that Kennan was born. Kennan was fascinated with Chekhov, and we'll get more about that later. He was raised as a Presbyterian. Presbyterians in Milwaukee I hate to generalize. I think they were starched. They believed in elites. Elites were white men. It was really that simple. His mother, so his father, his Presbyterian father, he really basically had no relationship at all with his father, and he was desperately his entire life until his death at 101. He he was marked, he was traumatized by never having had a mother. His older sister took up some of the missing space that his mother left behind. And this became very emotional in Kennan's life. Yeah, his sister Jeanette, um, Kennan was, she was not distant from father, but Kennan was. Kennan's father was a tax lawyer. Now, Kennan, as a white male from the Midwest, brilliant, became automatically a member of the elite. That's what elites were in America in the 1920s. They were white men who were clever. Now, there's tons of injustice to that and lots of lost opportunities in not bringing in people. Pluralism was never a big deal in the America of the 20s. It really was not the society we would imagine wanting to have now, but it was what it was. We do this without great judgment. He went to Princeton, an elite university, and in those days, a clever young white man would be taken by older people of the same background. And the path was very easy to go to an elite Ivy League college, Princeton in this case, majored in history, and later into the Foreign Service where he didn't have to compete. They just came and said, "You're smart. We're going to take you and turn you into a diplomat." And things were very different back then. Now, in his Princeton years, 1920, 25, and a little bit before, what did he read? It's very important. And we benefit by, we actually know what he read. He was very marked by Thomas Mann Buddenbrooks, published in 1901, which he read in 1920, the year before he went to Princeton. Buddenbrooks, you may be familiar, is a story of a very eminent German family, um, and yet at the end, the logic of this book, this novel, is the family achieves a very high place in society, economically and socially, but by the time you notice it, it's already in decline. I don't think I even need to interpret that. You can see that Kennan had the sense from a very early age of great families, great nations, great social institutions appearing to reach a zenith, a very high point socially, economically, commercially, and yet inevitably they decline. This obviously helped him visualize what was happening in the Soviet Union. It had reached a high point, and he believed that inevitably, it would go down. The other book that marked him very much was, and this looks kind of antiquated, doesn't it? Edward Gibbon, 18th century, his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. This Kennan read in the 1940s during World War II. And he read, this is a very lengthy tome, in which Gibbon, 18th century British writer, analyzes um, why did the Roman Empire fall? Well, Gibbons used this phrase, which nobody would use today, to chastise the contumacy, which is nonsense to a 20th century user of the English language, but which then meant basically, um, if you try too hard, and if you extend too far, and if you overextend, you will be punished, chastised. You will be chastised. So um, this introduced the idea of the Roman Empire, by far the greatest political entity in terms of power of its age, and yet inevitably it went down, and Edward Gibbon traces. Now, Kennan, we almost can't imagine Kennan, who was posted in Europe and in Germany, in Portugal, in the Soviet Union, in in Riga, Latvia. These are all European countries. Um, uh, in those days, things did not happen quickly. If you had to travel from your posting in Lisbon or in Riga back to Washington, you did so by train and by ship. You did not go by airplane, which gave you all the time in the world in crossing the Atlantic on a ship, all the time to read. And that's what he did. He read, and he read profoundly into Gibbons. And so we know that between Buddenbrook, Thomas Mann, and Gibbons, these were the two basic intellectual sources of Kennan's later ability to create a grand strategy, or to not to create it, but to visualize, to understand a grand strategy, which inevitably brought down the Soviet Union in 1991. Now we don't need to dwell too much on every aspect of his career, but let's jump to 1933. The first time the United States recognized the Soviet Union in the sense of having diplomatic relations, they sent William C. Bullitt as ambassador, and and um, and Roosevelt sent. This was a big moment in American history. The Soviet Union was obviously troublesome to the United States. The Bolshevik Revolution was mistrusted. American diplomats were afraid and concerned. But by 1933, they realized this is a country and we need to have relations. So um, Franklin Roosevelt sent William C. Bullock as ambassador to the USSR. And Kennan had close contact with Bullitt and with the famous diplomats of that period. We call him Chip Bolin and Loy Henderson, people who were very concentrated. The world was, it wasn't the Cold War quite yet, but the world was basically the United States, and from the point of view of American diplomats, it was the United States on the one hand, and the various contesting major empires and or former empires and political entities, mainly in Europe. Um, the whole relationship with Asia, Africa, Middle East, that came later. But in the 30s, it was all about Europe, and with a great emphasis on the Soviet Union. Now, um, Kennan in 1938, important year, as we know, Kristallnacht and other things happening in Germany. In 1938, he was posted in Prague. From there, he was signed to Berlin. And then, fortunately or unfortunately for him, and by the way, when he was posted to Berlin, he was um, how can I say that? He was identified again as by white men as being a brilliant young colleague. And in fact, they said, we'd like to send you to Berlin to study any language you choose. Imagine an opportunity like that. In Berlin, obviously, you go to learn German. And he said, well, I think I want to learn Russian also. And he had the extreme luxury of being, his full-time job was to learn those two languages, which he did very well. Now, in 1941, um, um, the war started, of course, in 1939, September of 39, when Hitler invaded Poland. And here was Kennan stuck in Berlin during the war, and he was, in fact, interned at a prisoner of war camp. He wasn't tortured, he wasn't starved, he was a diplomat. And the Nazis made these distinctions. But he was marked by the oppression, the psychological oppression of being a prisoner of war as a diplomat, not a soldier, held by the Nazis for a 6-month period. He was released because diplomats were treated much better than others by the Nazi regime and sent as chargé d'affaires to Lisbon. Now, chargé d'affaires, what's the meaning of that? If you're not familiar, you're not an ambassador, you're not a deputy chief of mission. You are, in fact, you are the highest ranking officer in an embassy, but you don't have the authority of the ambassador. Only the ambassador presents letters of credentials to the sovereign head of state of the hosting country. So he had considerable ability to maneuver and to do interesting things in Lisbon, though he lacked the prestige of being actually an ambassador. Now, 1942, the World War II is raging. Kennan, who met uh, many times with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, convinced Roosevelt to negotiate with the Portuguese dictator Salazar to establish a U.S. naval base in the Azores. The Azores, of course, the series of islands belonging to Portugal. This became a strategic win for the United States because having a refueling station in the Azores made it much easier for American naval forces to cross the Atlantic. So Kennan did this. This was a matter of some importance. Now, Kennan was, his whole life, when we look back at it, had to do more with Soviet Union than any other country. Finally, in 1944, just before at the peak of the war, Hitler is invading the Soviet Union. This disgusting period on everybody's part. The number of dead. You're all aware of this. Anyway, Averell Harriman um, sent Kennan to Moscow in 1944 as the deputy chief of mission. As we've said a few times in this course, the ambassador is the titular head of an embassy and is the one making the public presence. The DCM is basically the one doing the work, um, making sure that the embassy is functioning, providing perspective and analysis. The DCM, frankly, does more work than the ambassador. So again, he did not have the prestige yet of being the ambassador. But as DCM, he was recognized in Washington as probably the smartest American diplomat in terms of understanding the Soviet Union. So after the end of World War II, when this thing called the Cold War was beginning, the relationship, of course, between Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt was a tricky thing. They had to be allies because only by opening the Eastern Front, having the Soviet Union fight the Nazis, without that, probably Hitler could have won the war. So this alliance, very painful, isn't it? To have to be allied with a country you distrust and hate, because there's another country that is an existential threat. So there was this alliance, U.S., UK, Soviet Union, and yet it was never meant to last. These were entities of very different philosophies and behavior, and nobody trusted Stalin. But later we'll see. This is a famous Balkan proverb. It is permitted to you in time of grave danger to walk with the devil to the other side of the bridge. I think Churchill used this expression. Kennan did also. The devil being the Soviet Union. I will walk with them. I will accept being their ally. But as soon as it's no longer needed, I'm against him. We'll go back. And so notice everything he does has to do with the Soviet Union. He had gone earlier as a junior officer. Um, then he was the DCM in 1944. He was reassigned in 1947 to the Soviet desk. And after sending in the long telegram in 1946, he decided that the public needed to know more about his thinking in that highly classified and secret cable. And he published it totally open source. I don't know if he thought he could fool people, but everyone immediately recognized this has to be George F. Kennan. It's basically the same document, the long telegram, and the X article in Foreign Affairs. Now, here's some things that Kennan said which guide us in understanding this guy, this very complicated person. He wrote he wrote voluminously journals and articles and books, and he repeatedly talks about there was some mysterious affinity, which I could not even explain to myself. This was when he visited Yasnaya Polyana, the estate left um, by Chekhov, by Antonin Chekhov, a beautiful little, not a mansion, but a beautiful country estate with a wonderful garden. Chekhov, was a medical doctor. He knew he was going to die of tuberculosis, and yet he planted a garden, knowing that he would never see the results of his planting. This profoundly affected Kennan's way of looking at life and at strategy. Plant the seeds and let the seeds prosper. Don't worry, just let it go. We'll talk a little bit later about this concept. Kennan imagined a utopian America. From before his birth, he did not like America, the America that he knew in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s. He did not like the sort of brutalist, um, um, commercial nature of the country, the very blunt ways in which Truman and Eisenhower and Nixon, he didn't like the way American presidents functioned, and presidents didn't much like him either. He was subtle; they were not. They were blunt. So let's look at the long telegram, which he wrote in February of 46. 5,000 plus words. I have included the text of the long telegram in your Google Classroom, and I believe it's under K for Kennan. I invite you to have a look at this. You don't need to read the whole thing. You scan it. Um, but his analysis is really very helpful in understanding this creature, um, Vladimir Putin. He uh, he was talking, of course, about Stalin, but when he describes his understanding of Stalin's motivation, it's pretty close, I think, to what Putin's thinking is. Stalin needs an enemy, needs an enemy. Stalin uses Marxist-Leninism as a justification. I have to your screen is fine, mine is not. I need to um, um, anyway. Uses Marxist-Leninism as a justification for the Soviet Union's instinctive fear. Remember fear as the basic common denominator of conflict back from September when we talked about this. Um, did did Stalin? Of course, Stalin was afraid. He'd been invaded by Hitler. The number of Soviet soldiers dead and Soviet citizens, the siege of Leningrad, horrible. He had every reason to have fear, um, and so the fear is real. The fear is genuine, and Kennan in his long telegram says the fear is real. The use of Marxist-Leninism, it's a fig leaf. It's not a real explanation of of Stalin's motivations and of the way the Soviet Union behaves. Fear is the real reason, but Marxist-Leninism is the fig leaf which gives fear some kind of rationale. Um, and so forth. He adds later in his article, it's clear that the main element of any, let's see, again, I might, let me, yeah, there are parts of the screen I cannot see, but you can see it, I can't. It's clear that the main element of any United States policy toward the Soviet Union must be that of long term. When he says long term, he's talking about grand strategy. I don't know if there were, again, I don't think he believed he was creating grand strategy, but he was doing it. Um, the Kremlin sees the world only as vassals or enemies. Wow, isn't that illustrative of how Vladimir Putin thinks? Either you are under his influence, either you're a vassal or a slave of him, or you are an enemy. You cannot be an independent nation standing aside and as a neighbor of the Russian Federation. You have to either be an enemy or a vassal. Kennan understood this in 1947. Again, in analyzing Stalin's thinking, I think you can almost substitute Putin's name for Stalin in here. He mentions in the X article, he actually quotes Gibbons. Now, everybody understood if you quote Gibbons, you are George F. Kennan. Everybody knew that Kennan had been influenced by um, Gibbons to chastise the contumacy. So he was flirting here, I think. I mean, he wasn't stupid. He must have understood. If he quotes Gibbons in his article, he knew that he would be identified, I think. Um, and uh, to provide the world as his enemy, if he reiterates it to chastise the contumacy, again, um, the Gibbons idea of if you overextend, you will lose. The Roman Empire, in the case of Gibbons, but Kennan took this concept and applied it to the Soviet Union, and he was quite right. The Soviet Union overextended and brought itself down. He quoted Gibbons as his inspiration for that. On Buddenbrooks, again, everybody knew that Kennan had read Buddenbrooks. Human institutions often show the greatest outward brilliance at the moment when inner decay is in reality farthest advanced. Here he was, of course, talking about the Soviet Union. How did this become deeply embedded in not only in his logic, but in his own psychology? Buddenbrooks of Thomas Mann. So again, when you see in astronomy, if you see an exploding star, you're not seeing it in the present because the speed of light, the universe is so very distant from us that if you see a star exploding, you know that in fact you're looking at something that happened billions of years ago. This is pretty spiritual. Uh, Now, the 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 bottom line, as we say in the X article, to avoid destruction. Again, Kennan did not like American culture. He didn't like the commercialism, but he did side. He was certainly identified himself as an American because it was the lesser of evils. The evil was the Soviet Union and, of course, Nazi Germany, but he did want the United States to survive. He imagined the United States might someday regain its earlier utopian state of pragmatism and sort of independence of action. I think he was romanticizing an America which never really existed, but um, his urging, this is the closest he ever came to saying, here's what I think. Now, here's what I think you should do. Going from thought to action. To avoid destruction, the United States need only measure up to its best traditions, um, and which are worthy of preservation as a great nation. He knew that the United States was a great nation with all its flaws and unattractive features, which he did not like, and yet he had somewhere within a belief that the United States could and should prevail if it maintained loyalty to its own inner principles. He was not sure that the United States would be capable of doing that, but he urged, the elite small number of people who wrote this article. He said, just continue, don't worry, just be true to yourself, and you'll see things will come out okay. He was right. He had no idea that he would be proven right only 70 years later, when the Soviet Union collapsed. Now, I said that Kennan was a very complicated and unhappy person. He did not really believe in democracy. He was an elitist from an elite background. I hate the rough and tumble of our political life. I hate democracy. I hate the press. I hate the people. And I have clearly become un-American. He was joking here, sort of. I mean, he was always, if not American, what was he? He was American. And he has this delightful passage, which is reprinted in many versions of biographies and articles. Democracy is like a prehistoric monster. Think of a dinosaur with a body as big as this room and the brain the size of a pin. He lies there in his comfortable primeval mud and pays little attention to his environment. Here the metaphor is the United States and its democracy is very slow to act. It can't be bothered. However you torment it, it'll just carry on, indifferent to things that you do to try to get its attention. He is slow to wrath. In fact, you practically have to whack his tail off to make him aware that his interests are being disturbed. But once he grasps this, he lays about him with a savage determination that he not only destroys his adversary, but also wrecks his native habitat. This is a very funny passage. We think of U.S. policy during Vietnam. He was very opposed to the Vietnam intervention on the part of the United States. He later in life, it became very clear this notion of containment, which was interpreted in different ways. Later, decades later, he said, "No, I didn't mean confront them. What I meant was don't get into a conflict. Do everything to avoid a conflict." He was too subtle. We can go quickly over this. Isaiah Berlin, who was a great inspiration to John Lewis Gaddis, the biographer, but also to Kennan. Isaiah Berlin brought this notion out of ancient Greece, the Aesop's fable. Aesop would anthropomorphize animals to illustrate some features of how humans behave. The hedgehog and the fox, which was a ancient Greek myth of Aesop, and Isaiah Berlin, born in the Soviet Union, but ended up in Oxford, was an agent, I think an intelligence agent, an espionage agent in Washington during World War II. Everybody loved Isaiah Berlin, and he was much cited. He was a great inspiration for Kennan and many others, John Lewis Gaddis. In the Greek concept, the hedgehogs are the animals that have vertical knowledge. We've talked about this before. They go deep into the ground. They understand one thing, and they don't have a grasp of the relative combinations of things that are happening on the surface, but rather they go deep down into one aspect, usually something resembling an obsession of some sort. And when you look at historic figures, the Emperor of Persia, when he invaded the different Greek states, Sparta, Athens, and the various small city-states on the Aegean. Philip II, we talked about him earlier, when he was obsessed with keeping Catholicism as the sole religion in his ancestral domain, which included the lowlands, included Holland and Belgium. Napoleon with his obsession of invading Russia. How stupid. Hitler. These rulers, there are many others, and we meet people in our everyday lives who are tend to be either hedgehogs, they understand one thing, or they are foxes who are more suited to understanding the surface environment. And they look beyond their own obsessions, and sometimes they give up their obsession in favor of a strategy which will help them um, prevail in a conflict. Queen Elizabeth, of course, um, the the British monarch who was in constant conflict with the Catholic king like Philip II, and who created this thing called the British Navy. I mean, in the 16th century, it wasn't much, but it was compared to other countries. Only Spain had its armada. Only Spain had a naval presence as significant. But Elizabeth understood, let's look beyond Europe. Let's explore the Western Hemisphere. And Francis Drake. She believed in the British explorers who would extend British influence. Britain under Queen Elizabeth I was not all that powerful a country, but it became so partly because of her interest in extending, not overextending, but extending British influence by use of naval power. Maybe Roosevelt was a fox, maybe Churchill. Now, Kennan was a real pitiful medical case. I mean, he had psychological problems, he had physical problems. Here's just a list of some of the medical problems he had at the top. These are physical. Below, um, I'm not being judgmental. It's just a fact. He was anti-Semitic. He was racist. He didn't like American culture. Um, and again, I refer to Gaddis's insistence on calling his biography George Kennan, An American Life. He was paranoid. He carried suicide pills around. Especially when he was in Moscow, he was terrified of being grabbed by the agents of Joseph Stalin. Frankly, he was carrying on with Soviet women at times, and he understood that if he were caught in flagrante, he would have to commit suicide. So he was a pretty tortured um, character, and we get this, when I say certain self-destructive tendencies, the most outstanding example after being junior officer, DCM, the Soviet desk. And going back, finally, he had his moment that he'd waited for all of his life, sent by Harry Truman to be the ambassador. Finally, in 1951, waited 30 years for this prestige that he wanted so badly. It was a disaster. He went to the Soviet Union in 1951. In 1952, he stopped in the Tempelhof airport in Berlin on his way just for a routine visit from Moscow back to Washington. And on this occasion, the journalists asked him, "So, Mr. Kennan, how is life in the Soviet Union?" And idiotically, he said, "Well, kind of like it was sort of the way it was under Hitler," because he remembered having been interned for 6 months in 1942. Well, it's pretty much like Hitler. Stalin went crazy. He said, "You are now persona non grata. I will not allow you to continue to represent your country in mine. You're out." So Kennan, um, after waiting all his life for this opportunity, made it only through 6 months of this assignment. It's funny. I mean, he destroyed himself. This was so stupid. Uh, the journalist said, "What's it like?" He could have said anything, but he said, "Kind of like Hitler's Germany." Stalin, you can imagine how enraged Stalin was. So that was basically the end of his active diplomatic life. He did have diplomatic assignments after that, but parallel to his actual assignments in the field, he um, his telegram, his X article and his long telegram, in which he mentioned, I've read those several times. I see the word containment only once in 5,000 words. I don't think he really meant for that word containment to be his legacy. It's kind of a throwaway. I urge you to have a look at these documents. He talks about containment. But from that word, um, political figures like Harry Truman took what they superimposed their own beliefs on this almost casual reference to containment. And in the case of Truman, he took it the opposite of what Kennan really meant. Kennan was subtle, Truman was not. Truman saw this word containment. He said, aha, what Kennan means is we need to be militarily able to go to war with the Soviet Union. And he created what we now call the Truman Doctrine, um, which was basically, it was a belligerent position, very open and very explicit towards the Soviet Union. You've taken over Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, the Baltics. We don't like it, but it is the world we live in, not the world we would like to live in. But if you act against Turkey or Greece, there will be war. That was the Truman Doctrine. We'll let you go with these other Eastern European countries. We don't like what you've done. You promised you would have elections in Poland, and you betrayed Poland by not having elections. It is what it is. Don't even try to do this in Turkey and Greece. Now, we now know that Kennan was really alarmed. He didn't like this at all. He didn't like his ideas being converted into um, ideas of belligerence, of antagonism. It's not what he had in mind at all. What he meant was keep things as they are, avoid conflict. Um, then along came Paul Nitze. If we have time, I might even have some comments today on Paul Nitze. Paul Nitze was the mirror image of Kennan. They lived at approximately the same time. Nitze did not live to be 101, but he was 90 something. These two individuals knew each other very well. They disagreed on everything, and they were very good friends and very good colleagues. The NSC 68, which also is in your Google Classroom documents, is the response basically to the X article and the long telegram, in which Nitze in 1950 basically articulated the Truman Doctrine. This was belligerent. Um, I'd like to have a sort of a separate series of comments on Nitze. Nitze was the opposite of Kennan. Kennan, unhappy, neurotic, tortured, never quite finding his métier. Nitze was the opposite. Um, he knew himself. He was confident. He went from success to success. He had positions in the US government. He never got to be Secretary of State, but he had a profound influence on US policy. And Kennan, after being an active diplomat, became the head of a unit created by Harry Truman. What do we do with John Kennan? He's messing everything up. Let's create a thing called the Bureau of Policy Planning, and we'll put Kennan in charge of it. It's a tiny little think tank within the State Department. Kennan was the head of it in 1948, 49. When it came time for him to leave, how astonishing. Kennan picked Nitze, who disagreed with him on everything, and he said, the best substitute to take my place in the Bureau of Policy Planning would be Paul Nitze. Amazing, amazing. The NSC 68, which was this top secret document, was the Truman Doctrine, which Kennan hated. But he did not hate the author, Nitze. It's a fascinating thing. Later in life, Svetlana Alliluyeva, who was the daughter of Stalin and who she decided to go away from the Soviet Union to integrate herself into America. She believed in America, fascinating character, and became very close friends with Kennan, maybe his best friend. He helped her when she came to America. He found her where to live and how to live and where to work, and they became very good friends. And she became one of his best supporters. Um, some of the things that Svetlana Alliluyeva said to Kennan tell us more about Kennan than other comments. She said she understood he was neurotic, he was unhappy, he was disappointed. She said, wait, no, no, no. She said in a letter to him, you were one of those naturally by birth great American idealists to whom artists, utopians, politicians belong. People like Abraham Lincoln, Walt Whitman, Frank Lloyd Wright. And, she's flattering him, but she really believes this. They were misunderstood. They suffered. She compares him to these other notable Americans that says, you're like them. You go against the grain. You're great. People should respect you. You don't get the respect that you need. And she says, I don't want you to be frustrated. I don't want you to be sad. You should go somewhere, maybe Scotland, where you could get away from the madness of Princeton. He was in his later decades. He had free reign he got an office and a salary to go back to Princeton, where he had been a student decades earlier. Um, she said, you're a retired ambassador. You're demoralized. You deserve to be happy. Um, and you should be entitled to live the way you want. She was very supportive of him, and she understood. She may have been the only person who understood how unhappy he really was. Um, John Lewis Gaddis' biography, 2011, was the first one that was authorized that had all the documents and which analyzed Kennan's career, his thinking, his influence on foreign policy. A later biography by Frank Castigliola, uh, University of Connecticut, much later in 2023, just 2 years ago, published a very different biography, which had to do with Kennan's psychological problems. Never mind, well, of course, he mentioned Kennan's role in developing grand strategy and his very important role in leading American diplomats and writers and intellectuals on what do we do about the Soviet Union. Kennan's impulse was very simple. Don't fight. Don't get into war. But nobody understood him. And because they didn't, he was kind of crazy. Castigliola, in his biography, talks about an entirely different aspect of Kennan, which was basically his neurotic tendencies. We know from Kennan's diaries, he was fascinated with Sigmund Freud, and he saw the world not so much as nations contesting one another, but rather the human spirit in conflict with itself, civilization versus eros. What a person believes in their soul and what they do in their imperfect actions. And we know he married to a Norwegian and very bored with his Norwegian wife. He looked for other sources of consolation when he was in Moscow and elsewhere. And he was very divided. He was a very sensual man. He had great physical attraction to many women. And in his own character, he understood this was a great conflict because he had impulses that made him do things that he did not think were good things. But he also had the opposite tendency, which was civilization, which is basically the repression of bad impulses, right? And so he saw this as two sides of himself, and had a nervous breakdown in 1935. Um, we get sort of to the end of what I want to say about Kennan. Um, I mentioned earlier, he loved Anton Chekhov. He really wanted to be the biographer of Anton Chekhov. He was left with being sort of a diplomat, sort of an analyst. He wrote the defining document that defined the Cold War from the Western standpoint, and yet inside, in his inner soul, he loved Chekhov, and he talks about his love of Chekhov. Chekhov, who died the year Kennan was born. There's some funny symmetries here. Now, let's see. Yeah, there is a quote. I think it comes later. No, okay. There's a quote where Kennan talks about seeing a Chekhov play. This must have been in the 40s, maybe, and completely losing it, bursting into tears, ashamed of himself for making such a spectacle. He couldn't hold back. He found Chekhov so touching, so deeply concordant with his own sense of what humanity could be. He loved Chekhov. And this is a very important part of if understanding this very complicated man, his love of the cherry orchard. I was blubbering like well, here it is. I sat there blubbering like a child, trying desperately to keep the rest of the company from noticing it. He broke out into uncontrollable crying when he saw the cherry orchard. Now, um, Chekhov was a medical doctor. He was a playwright. Um, he was also a gardener. And Kennan, in describing what can we best do as diplomats, as practitioners in this thing. I don't think he used the word grand strategy, but I used the word. He did this thing called grand strategy. We must be gardeners, not mechanics. I said earlier, plant the seeds, turn away, don't bother too much with the seeds once you've planted them. Have faith, have confidence that the seeds will grow. When he saw the garden at Menichovo, which was Chekhov's garden, he was deeply moved. This must have been one of the most deep psychological experiences of his life when he went to see Yasna Polyana. I think it was 1952, after the war. He loved this garden, a garden that Chekhov planted, knowing he would never see it because he knew his life would be cut short by tuberculosis. This notion of the diplomat as gardener, when um, uh, George Shultz, who also lived to 101, and who was, I compare, he was kind of, in the best sense, he wasn't neurotic, he wasn't crazy like Kennan, but he also thought of diplomacy as a garden. You plant the garden, you develop relationships. You don't think, what will this relation do tomorrow for me? No, 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 no. Tend the garden. Nick Burns, a great American diplomat, on the occasion of the death of George Shultz, said this is very easily transposed to Kennan. Kennan and Schultz were really had the same approach to their profession. They had different psychologies, but they both saw diplomacy as a matter of planting seeds and then having the faith that the seeds would take root. Same thing with George Schultz. Now, I guess we've run out of time today. When the Gaddis book came out in 2011, some of the greatest essays that we've seen in decades were published in the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, many, many commentaries on the occasion of the publication of Gaddis's book in 2011. Kissinger, Louis Menon of the New Yorker, all characterized Kennan as a realist. Imagine that. Kissinger, of course, superimposing his own beliefs and his own character. He was a realist, I guess, if anybody was. And Kissinger saw in Kennan a realist. They were wrong. Kennan was not, maybe he was a realist, but in terms of hawk or dove, hawk belligerent, dove more pacifist, Kennan was clearly more of a dove. He made this very clear um, decades after his career. He went to the Senate to testify his disgust, his criticism of the U.S. war in Vietnam. He was totally opposed to it. He was opposed to the Truman Doctrine. And so it was interesting when the Gaddis book is a masterpiece. I highly recommend it. When it came out in 2011, there was a surge of fascinating articles saying, was he a realist? Most of them said sometimes when you say realist, we think Hawk, realist. But I, I guess you could say Kennan was a realist, but that's pretty crude, um, superficial thinking. Realist, idealist, that puts people in categories that lack the nuance that Kennan had. He was a very nuanced guy. So was he a hawk? Was he a dove? Kennan himself, or at an earlier time, 1992, after the the disappearance of the Soviet Union as a country in 1991, was listening to all this. He's retired. He's back in Princeton. He's kind of neurotic, but he still is an important voice. And he was hearing people giving um, Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush credit for ending the Cold War. Did the GOP, that's the Republican Party, did the Republican Party win the Cold War? Ridiculous, said Kennan back in 1992. The suggestion that any administration had the power to influence decisively the course of a tremendous upheaval in another great country on the other side of the globe is simply foolish. And he quotes a Russian proverb: imagine a fly on the nose of an ox. The ox goes out to plow the fields, and then at the end of the day, the fly explains to his friends, we've been plowing. You see how ridiculous it is for a fly to take credit for the work of an ox. And this is how Kennan saw the idiotic, in his view, idiotic idea that a single political party could have ended the Cold War. Um, I want to, I think we've used up the time for today. I want to, as a counterpoint to Kennan, it's very important to understand who was Paul Nitze and why and how did he oppose everything Kennan said. And yet, these two individuals worked together in tandem, and between the dovish qualities of Kennan and the hawkish qualities of Nitze, somehow it all worked and brought down the Soviet Union. I'd like to give Nitze the proper time. We'll do that on another occasion, maybe um, possibly next Monday. We'll see about that. But so again, this may seem remote from the discipline that we're looking at, strategy, crisis management, but I think it's an important element purely from history. But history does have lessons. They're not all applicable. But I think what we should try to remember from Kennan, the diplomat as gardener, don't expect immediate results. Have confidence that what you're doing in the long run will prevail. And I think we'll leave it at that for today. And tomorrow, I invite anybody who wants to observe. We'll reenact the Suez Crisis of 1956, a crazy moment in history, um, which could have resulted. In fact, the Khrushchev at that time was threatening nuclear war if the wrong thing had happened during the Suez Crisis. As we know, it wasn't exactly resolved. France and Great Britain were kind of humiliated because President Eisenhower was enraged. If you have any interest in that, just join us tomorrow. That might be fun. It'll be work for the 6 volunteers, and thank you to those people for doing that. And then Thursday, Michael Clark from King's College London, who is a military analyst. He might be willing to talk about the current situation. Pokrovsk, of course, is a terrible drama that's playing out in real time today. This sort of very strategically unimportant, but psychologically very important battle being waged over an 18-month period between Russia and Ukraine in northeastern Ukraine. It's a dreadful, tragic thing. We don't know how it's going to come out. We don't know if Western Europe is really going to fill the void that's left by President Trump and being big ambivalent about should we help Ukraine? Of course we should help Ukraine. It's for Western Europe to act decisively if they decide to, and I hope they do. So we'll hear from Michael Clark on Thursday, and I think that's it for today. Thank you, everybody. We've gone way into sort of very esoteric topics here, but I think sometimes we should just pause, take a breath, look at history, and see what we might learn from it. So thank you, everybody. What you're giving me hearts and applause? No, give them rather to Kennan, this crazy, miserable man who saved the human race. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.